Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. In the Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council declare that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups, and of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. That quote was taken from Dignitatis Humanae, number 2. Nevertheless, the Council's Declaration on Religious Liberty did not spell out the answers to several questions, at least not with sufficient clarity. As a result, it has generated continuous debate. One difficulty consists in explaining how it stands in continuity with earlier papal teachings. Another consists in defining the due limits to religious liberty. In this interview, Michael Dunnigan discusses the Declaration and some of the best literature on it. Michael Dunnigan is an attorney practicing in 2 distinct legal systems, the Anglo-American system of common law and the Catholic Church's legal system known as canon law. He is Associate Professor of Canon Law at St. Meinrad Seminary in St. Meinrad, Indiana, and holds a degree from Georgetown, a doctorate in canon law from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, and a master's degree in theology from St. Mary's University, San Antonio. He has delivered speeches and written articles on a variety of subjects, including individual rights, the sexual abuse crisis in the Church, parish closings, art and architecture, the Church's Latin liturgical heritage, Catholic associations, and comparative law. He is author of Religious Liberty and the Hermeneutic of Continuity, Conservation and Development of Doctrine at Vatican II, published by Emmaus Academic in 2023. Professor Michael Dunnigan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Father. It's wonderful to be with you.
What is the central teaching of Dignitatis Humanae?
The central teaching is that every person has a right, a natural right to religious liberty. And religious liberty is understood as an immunity in making religious decisions, an immunity in the sense of being protected from being forced to embrace a religion or to complete a religious act that one does not wish to do, but also an immunity protecting a person's outward actions within limits, not an absolute liberty, but within limits. Our religious actions can be curtailed or even prevented if they're harmful to society, harmful objectively to the public order. So we're talking about a natural right, but it's a right within limits, which is going to make it very different from some of the understandings of rights coming out of the Enlightenment.
Dignitatis Humanae has generated so much discussion among people of good faith. This could be because the document is too vague, or the issue is too mired in contingencies when it comes to concrete cases. It could also be because many misread it through a secularist lens. In your view, why has the Declaration generated so much discussion and interpretive headaches?
That's a very important question, and also some very important alternatives that you give. Definitely the last one. That's definitely in play. The reading of Dignitatis Humanae through a secularist lens, or people just assuming that things are in the document that are not. One of the scholars who's a real leader on Dignitatis Humanae is Russell Hittinger, and he has an essay where he talks about the need for real modesty in respecting the silences of the document. And one of the problems, I think, everywhere, but maybe especially in the United States, is a frequent assumption that this very important scholar, John Courtney Murray, who contributed a great deal, very important person, contributed a great deal, really made a lot of positive contributions. However, he had some problematic ideas too, but there's an assumption, because especially after the council, he was so esteemed both publicly and by the U.S. bishops. There's a tendency, I think elsewhere, but especially in the U.S., to conflate Dignitatis Humanae and its content with John Courtney Murray's thought. And some of his thought is in the document, but on some very important issues, especially the relationship between the church and secular governments. Murray really lost those battles at the council, but he refought them afterwards in kind of the wake of his sort of celebrity during and after the council. He was quite well known even in the early 60s. And that has been a big problem in some of the recent scholarship. One of the things you see in many scholars is, I hope, some appreciation for Murray's real contributions, but also a caution of identifying Murray too closely with the document. So that's really part of it. The first part is the language too vague? That's a good question, but a difficult one. Because what the document does is something really very difficult. It holds on to previous teaching, and it avoids giving a judgment on previous arrangements between the church and civil governments. But at the same time, it recognizes this right. And I think another misunderstanding is that people assume when the church recognizes this right in Dignitatis Humanae, that what that means is we have a right to embrace any religion. That what the content of the right is the content of any religion. And that's not the way the document reads. What the document says is we have an immunity essentially in making religious decisions. So we might make a decision that we don't really have a right to. We might reject the known truth, or we might reject the unknown truth. So objectively, there's a difficulty with what we're deciding. But what the document is saying is that even so, even if there is a problem with my decision, you can't force me to make the right decision, and you can't even prevent me from acting on my wrong decision unless I create a social problem. I actually harm your rights or somebody else's rights or the church's rights or other religious bodies' rights, or I create some moral problem. So I'm sympathetic with complaints about the vagueness of the document, but it's really trying to do a very difficult thing, and still, despite all the attention, not that well understood. You'll see even scholars, usually more in the popular vein than strictly scholarly vein, but commentators anyway, describe the right as a right to embrace any religion. And that's not what it is. It's an immunity in making religious decisions and in completing religious actions. So it's doing a delicate operation. So there might be complaints about the language, but I think it might have been difficult to improve on it.
I think also, you mentioned, on the popular level, many people misunderstand that when the church talks about rights, it normally derives rights from duties. So first of all, it's the duty to adhere to the truth about our ultimate end and order our lives accordingly. And from that duty derives the right to be free from interference that would impede one's freedom of inquiry in seeking the truth.
Absolutely. And that also goes to your other point about the difficulty of a secularist lens, because usually in the West, when we think of rights, we're claiming our own rights, and that's all we're talking about. And the church's approach is very different. Rights are always tied together with duties. Every right has a corresponding duty or several corresponding duties. And the very, very important in religious liberty. The council is talking about a right in civil society. So it's a right, my right against you, your right against me, our rights against our governments, rights against other groups. So it's really, it's a right in civil society. However, it's at the service of an objective duty to seek God, and when found, to embrace Him, to seek the truth. So it's another thing that makes this difficult. We're talking about a right in civil society, but it's at the service of this moral right. So in a sense, the council is not addressing the moral realm in the first instance, because it's the subtitle of the document says we're talking about a right in civil society. However, we have this right because the person must have it. And he must have it because he has this duty that you mentioned. He has this duty to seek the truth and to seek God. And he's a religious being by nature. He's a seeker of truth by nature. He's a social being by nature, and he's a religious being by nature.
Currently, what are the main interpretive positions regarding Dignitatis Humanae? The main schools of interpretation?
Good. The probably the two largest, or the sort of the biggest divide, would be between those who believe that the document can be reconciled with previous tradition, and those who believe that it cannot. That would be the basic divide. But what's interesting is in the second camp, those who do not believe that it can be reconciled, there's an interesting split. Traditionalist Catholics, like the Society of St. Pius X and similar groups, would use this as criticism of the document, saying we need to go back because Dignitatis Humanae departs from what previous popes, especially the 19th century popes, taught. However, then you have progressive moral theologians. And I'm thinking of kind of the proportionalist or consequentialist brand of moral theologians. They actually applaud the departure from tradition and say, again, I'm speaking in broad terms. I don't mean to paint with too broad of a brush, but you do see, for instance, Father Charles Curran would have been a leader in this area, saying that the church changed its teaching at Vatican II on religious liberty so she can change her teaching on contraception. She can change her teaching on in vitro fertilization. She can change her teaching on marriage. So you really have moral teaching, I think, very much at stake, and a very interesting divide in that second camp, that those who do not believe their reconciliation is possible. Some of those who believe their reconciliation is possible, I'll just mention a couple of names. A real leader is a French Benedictine monk named Basile Valouet. An Australian priest, Brian Harrison, is also a leader here. Russell Hittinger, who I mentioned, and then a professor at Mount St. Mary's in the U.S. in Maryland named Barrett Turner has done a very good dissertation on this as well. Among those who do not believe that the document can be reconciled, among the proportionist theologians, or what seem to me to be proportionalist theologians, Father Curran in the United States is very important. I believe he's still alive, but he's quite elderly. And you have others. I believe Hans Kung was in this category, probably Richard McBrien. And then among traditionalist authors, you have some works by Archbishop Lefebvre himself. Probably the more important ones, though, there was a I believe, a priest of the society named Bernard, I believe French priest named Bernard Lucien, Lucien, and I think his work is probably the most important of the traditionalist work.
But among those who would postulate rupture, you would also have perhaps the School of Bologna in its interpretation of the council with relation to preceding tradition. And among those who interpret compatibility, you would have perhaps Professor Thomas Pink, whose view would be somewhat different from the other authors you've mentioned. So there's even more plurality.
Absolutely. With Bologna, I think the Bologna school would be close to Murray's position, in the sense of feeling like for instance, what someone like Brian Harrison would point to, and probably Basile Vallée as well, very late changes to the document that really preserved its orthodoxy. These are things that Vallée and Harrison and Hittinger would champion and say, well, this is good. This was a positive progress in the long drafting process. And this made the document something that can be harmonized with previous tradition. However, Murray and the Bologna school were not happy with the final product, and they would say that that sort of the quote real document was the parts that emphasized newness, and these late changes that usually came kind of at the behest of the Pope Paul VI, those detracted from kind of the quote real spirit of the council, the quote real spirit of the document. That's their view. I certainly don't agree with that. I think that Harrison and Vallée and Hittinger would be correct that these late changes are very key, and that's just the fact is that's what the council adopted. That's just the bottom line. And then yes, in about the last 10 or 15 years, Thomas Pink has emerged as a very interesting person. What's funny is he shares some similarities with John Courtney Murray, of all people, which is strange because his real audience, I believe, are more kind of traditionalist Catholics. And when he kind of arrived on the scene, I think there was a real hopefulness that he had that he'd found a good way of reconciling the document with tradition, but in a way that would be acceptable to the traditionalist faithful. And I admire him for making that attempt. I admire him for sticking with this issue for a long time. But I don't think that he succeeded in that project. He essentially interpreted Dignitatis Humanae, or still continues to interpret Dignitatis Humanae, as a change in policy, a change in church policy or church law, but not really a doctrinal change. And there's some truth to that. There is some change in policy in the document. However, Dignitatis Humanae states right at the beginning that we're speaking of doctrine. Our intention, the Father's intention in this document, is to develop the teaching of recent popes on the inviolable rights of the human person. We're talking about natural law here. We're making some kind of pronouncement on natural law and on the constitutional order of society. Now, those things, addressing the order of society in our day, that certainly could be more law or policy. But when we're talking about the inviolable rights of the human person, clearly a teaching there and not only a policy.
But in his defense, he might say that he's not disputing its doctrine. He would understand the framework of that doctrine somewhat differently. He would say that the framework is the relation between the church and the state as its instrumentum, its instrument, the secular arm of the church. So those conditions no longer hold. The state has no power over the enforcement of religious matters.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that was what at first appeared to be a hopeful thing in Pink's scholarship, this emphasis, and that's where he's similar to Murray. Murray also reads the document essentially as a document about the state. This is about the the person confronting state power, and and Pink writes almost exclusively about that. The difficulty is, again, it's that reading is too attenuated from the text of the document itself. Text makes really clear. All you have to do is read it to make clear that it's not talking only about state power. It's talking about a right that we have um, against other people and against social groups and against what the council calls every human power. So this is a real weakness, I believe, in both Murray's and Pink's writing, with all due respect. Um, Murray is going to, and Pink to some extent, though I don't know if Pink isn't, I don't think, quite as wedded to this argument as Murray. Murray's whole idea, or one of his probably his favorite idea, is that the foundation of the right is the incompetence of the state. The reason we have a right to religious liberty is because this is an area where the state is disqualified from acting. So he's essentially really not talking about theology. He's really talking about political philosophy. He's talking about really a development in political philosophy. Um, the difficulty there, and Pink latches onto this again because he's very interested in talking about the coercive power of the state versus the coercive power of the church. So he's also, I mean, Pink just asserts several times what this document is about is a right against the state, and it's the document itself. This is section 2 or article 2. This freedom, religious liberty, means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, etc. So, by no means limited to the state. And we have a lot of problems if we look at the document only as talking about the state. Look at what ISIS does. Are we going to say, well, ISIS is not violating religious liberty? uh, when I mean they're doing much more than that, but because they're not a state actor, they're not reached by this document. That they have not run afoul of this document or of a sound understanding of religious liberty because they're not a state. Or the same with individuals. If we coerce each other or engage in unworthy proselytism, dishonest or abusive proselytism, that we're not violating another person's rights. I think the council's clear that we are violating each other's rights when we engage in those activities.
You've already mentioned Murray, and presumably this is a subject which the books you recommend will also address. But who were the other main protagonists in the drafting of Dignitatis Humanae?
Oh, wonderful, wonderful question. Let me start with uh, my sort of trinity of there's the three people who I believe were really the three indispensable people that without them we would not have this document. And one is Murray. I'm critical of Murray in some ways, but I really think that if one believes that this is a positive development in the church's life, uh, one owes some gratitude to Murray because he was such a catalyst for this, and really was thinking about this before most other people. Who else? The bishop who was the official relator of the document was the Bishop of Bruges, Emile de Smet. Very interesting person. Made a number of important speeches throughout the council. lot of them on religious liberty, but also on other subjects too. And he really produced the official statements, what would be called the relatio, or the various relationes of the documents. There would be a written version and then an oral version, and sometimes they would be almost the same, but sometimes they would be different. But there would be one on each draft, and this document had an unusually high number of drafts. So he was just a key person, and also I would say a key person to that the document came out preserving the really recognizing this new right, having this important kind of innovation in some ways, but an innovation built on parts of the church's tradition, and an innovation put forward in a way that did not contradict previous teaching, in my view. And then the other person, Paul VI, I think, was really very important, took a very direct personal interest, and was very important more towards the later stages. But this document was important to him. He made a number of speeches about it after the council, and both he and the Pope since the council have made the document really the cornerstone of their diplomatic policy. So I would put them probably in the first, give pride of place to those three. But then several other important characters. A very important collaborator of Murray's was an Italian priest who later became a cardinal named Pietro Pavan. And he's very interesting because he was a great ally of Murray's. So you sometimes hear Murray's position called the American position at the council. It really should be the American Italian, because Pavan was probably doesn't get as much attention as he should, but shared most of Murray's opinions, but I think in some ways had religious liberty on a sounder basis. He, I think, had a more solid recognition of a basis of religious liberty as a natural right, as something that was not just a development of political philosophy, but this is a permanent achievement. This is just the recognition of religious liberty is a permanent achievement, and he lived a long life, and he wrote a lot on religious liberty too. So we have a lot from him. So he was very important. Another someone involved I think in every stage. I think the only person involved in every stage of the drafting process was a French priest named Jérôme Hammer, and he didn't write as much as Pavan, but wrote some very important articles after the council, and just very important as kind of a witness to the document. And then a very prominent French theologian, Dominican, Yves Congar, he was involved in some phases of the documents. So we have these great diaries of the council by prominent theologians, but most of them were not involved, unfortunately, with this document. But Congar was, at least in part. So we do have in his diary some descriptions of the at least the latter part of the genesis of the document. There probably are one or two others that I'm missing, but those were some of the most important ones.
And Pavan, if I'm not mistaken, was the ghostwriter of Mater Magistra and Pacimenteris.
I'm sorry, who?
Pavan.
Yeah.
Pavan was the ghostwriter.
I've heard that too.
John the 23rd, Socrates.
Yes, I think very, very well thought of, and again, really went on to have make a number of contributions. So yeah, I think very, very, very justly thought of, and I think he's appreciative because in some ways he's very similar to Murray, but I think he's a little bit more tied to the tradition than I think Murray tries to stay tied to the tradition. But as especially before the council and at the beginning. I mean, he wasn't present at the first session. He was really only present at the second and third. But from about 1964 onward, Murray really emphasizes this theory of the incompetence of the state, and I think that's regrettable. I think that is not this is just certainly not what the council chose. Murray tried to argue later that this could have been an alternate foundation, and some other scholars have adopted that. I do not agree with that, but I think what's nice about Pavan is you have some of the things we admire in Murray, but we also have, I think, a greater awareness of the need to be more in dialogue with the tradition, with the theological tradition, not only political thought. That is.
What prompted your own study on Dignitatis Humanae?
Oh, thank you. When I used to work as a civil lawyer for about 7 years, and then I kind of switched gears and took a position with a apostolate that worked in canon law. And in connection with that work, I went back to school and earned a master's degree in theology at night. And I had a class on ecclesiology, and we had to write sort of a long paper for this class. And I don't know if the professor suggested or if it just came along in my searching for a topic, but I came across this topic of can this be reconciled? And it just intrigued me, and really has never. So this was the late 1990s. It intrigued me then, and it still does. And so I wrote a paper in that class, but then I also decided in that program to write a master's thesis on the same subject. And then when I later studied canon law and did a licentiate thesis and then a doctoral dissertation. So really it was my master's work in an ecclesiology class where I was first exposed to this question, and it just intrigued me from the outset and really has never ceased to do so.
What does your study add to the existing literature and debates on the interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae?
I think that one of the things that I consider very important is this. It's clear from the document. I think the key question is, what is the foundation of the right to religious liberty? Because that's why this is such a problematic question, because we've had religious liberty recognized in some way or another at least as early as the late 16th century in Poland, mid 17th century in the U.S. state of Maryland, and you think there's like Erasmus talking about similar. So you had ideas that end up with religious liberty, but what were they based on? They often were based on skepticism or rationalism, or just a desire to be free from religious strife, largely in Germany, but elsewhere as well. And then with the Enlightenment, we've got the assertion of religious liberty, which can be considered an advance in some way, but based on things like skepticism. We just need to stop fighting, and religion is too hard to agree on anyway. We can't get to any certainty. It's not really the object of real knowledge, so let's not fight about it. It's almost irrational to fight about. And those are just bases the church could not accept, because they're not Christian bases. They're almost anti-Christian foundations for the right. And Murray's idea is of the incompetence of the state. And although it's clear from the document that Vatican II based the right on the dignity of the human person, Murray, and he's so influential after the council, he relitigates this and essentially says the incompetence of the state is an even better basis. And you still have, your mention of Thomas Pink is a great example. You still have people, and there's never been a want of people agreeing with Murray on that and saying, yes, this is what the document's really about. This is the real foundation of the document. Even if it's not what the council said, that's a sort of almost a better foundation than the council. So one of the things that I set out to do was to examine, could state incompetence have been the basis of the document? And my conclusion was no. There's a very long part 3B of my book is all on this sort of 3 chapters on the foundation of the right, and they're essentially about disagreeing with Murray and saying that the incompetence of the state is not a sound basis. For one thing, it does not get us to a natural right. It's a basis in political philosophy. It's not a basis in human rights. Murray does not talk about. Well, sometimes he will talk about the human person. I shouldn't say he doesn't, but the argument he really bet everything on, or most everything, was the incompetence of the state. And it's a shame because some of these other arguments are present in his writings, but they're not the ones that he championed. So that, I think, that's one of the things I most sought to look at. Could incompetence of the state serve as an alternate basis for the right to religious liberty? And my conclusion is no, that it could not. And then another thing that I hope to contribute was that it seemed to me that not just that there was a non-contradiction, but that if you almost have to really spend a lot of time with the documents, but it seemed to me that there was really a continuity, a real harmonization, a real positive, not just non-contradiction, real positive harmonization between the 19th century popes and Vatican II. In fact, in some ways, I think Vatican II, as I say, I believe Vatican II is primarily a teaching on the human person rather than the state. The state's very important. State must be included, but in the first instance, it's a teaching on the human person and what is owed to him just as a result of his being a human person. With the 19th century popes, they often are talking almost constantly both about the individual kind of moral context, these Enlightenment ideas, what harm do they have to the individual, but also what harm do they have on society? And so you see this concern for what I believe is the integrity of the person that we've got. And Leo the 13th makes it explicit. He says the kind of the problem with the persecution of the church is that the church is being taken out of any social role, and it's forcing people almost into a fragmentation of their person, that they're even repressive regimes often will let you practice your religion in private, but then they'll say not in public. And Leo points out, no, this is in these ideas that promote immoderate liberties or unlimited or absolute liberties often fragment this unity, this integrity of the person. Well, I think you have that idea. Now, that's a fairly subtle idea in Gregory the 16th and Pius the 9th. It's in some earlier popes too, Pius the 6th and Pius the 6th at least. But it's explicit in Leo the 13th. It's not his major theme, but it is explicit. But that's very important, addressing what is the human person, very important at Vatican II generally, but especially in this document. And so we have this, the Vatican II is going to tell us that by our nature, we express our religion in a social context. There are social manifestations. So it's an unnatural violation to curtail someone's religious practice just at home. And I think that this is really delivering on something that the 19th century popes really discovered and started to talk about, this idea of integrity. Now, the popes, they're especially concerned with their own Catholic faithful. That's what they're talking about, the integrity of the Catholic faithful, Leo in particular. But Vatican II, I think, is extending this teaching, but it's also emphasizing it. And I think it's giving it new life. So I don't think it's just the 19th century teachings, we're a little bit embarrassed about those because they're so hostile to the ideas that we're used to, or ideas that sound like the ones that we're used to. But we can, if we're careful, we can find a way to harmonize Vatican II so we don't have to be too embarrassed about the 19th century teaching. I don't think that's the approach at all. I think that we really see some really profound insight, both in the Vatican II document, but also the 19th century teaching. And there's really a very healthy flowing between the two, where like when De Verbum talks about doctrine, how it's making what was implicit explicit. These ideas were somewhat explicit in the 19th century popes, especially Leo, but Vatican II is really talking much more expressly about the human person. So I think there's, I really think there's some real unity there. So those would be two things. One other thing I would mention is there's a speech that Pope Paul VI gives at the end of the council, and I believe that has been misinterpreted. So my chapter 4 addresses that. I've kind of spoken at length, so I won't, unless you want to talk more about that, I won't say too much, but those would be the kind of the three things I would point at as what I hope are my contributions to the discussion.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.